Somewhere deep down, you already know something in this relationship feels wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not the kind of wrong people easily notice from the outside, but the kind that quietly steals your peace. You tell yourself things will stabilize soon, that if you stay patient, if you love a little better, if you understand them more deeply, the warmth will finally stay. But somehow, it never does. There are moments where everything feels real again, moments where the connection feels genuine, almost magical. And then, just as suddenly, the distance returns. The silence grows longer. The attention fades. The warmth disappears. Inside your mind, a small question begins to repeat itself. Did I do something wrong? If you have ever waited hours for a message, only to feel a strange wave of relief when it finally arrived, then you have already experienced the psychological force behind trauma bonding. Behavioral psychology calls this intermittent reinforcement. It is one of the most powerful learning mechanisms in the human brain. When affection appears consistently, the mind relaxes, but when affection appears randomly, sometimes present, sometimes gone, the brain begins chasing the next moment of warmth. Not because the relationship is healthy, because the uncertainty makes the reward feel more valuable. This is the same mechanism that keeps people pulling slot machines. The reward might appear at any moment, and that possibility becomes addictive. Here is the paradox most people never realize. Inconsistency doesn't weaken attachment, it intensifies it. The mind starts scanning for signs. A delayed message suddenly feels meaningful. A short reply becomes reassurance. A brief moment of affection feels like proof that the connection is still alive. Slowly, without noticing, your emotional energy shifts. You're no longer experiencing the relationship, you're maintaining it, trying harder, explaining more, giving more patience. And this is where trauma bonds quietly begin to form, not through constant cruelty, but through a cycle of warmth and withdrawal. And the mind, desperate to restore the warmth, begins doing something dangerous. It starts building explanations. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they're afraid of intimacy. Maybe if you just show more understanding, everything will return to the way it felt in the beginning. But here's the truth most people don't want to face. Trauma bonds rarely survive on love. They survive on hope mixed with uncertainty. And hope, when tied to unpredictability, can hold the human mind in place far longer than pain ever could. And hope, when tied to unpredictability, can hold the human mind in place far longer than pain ever could. This is why trauma bonds are so difficult to recognize while you are inside them. From the outside, the pattern looks obvious. Friends may tell you the relationship is draining you. They may point out the cycle: warmth, distance, apology, warmth again. But from the inside, the mind interprets the same pattern very differently. It remembers the good moments, the late-night conversations, the rare moments of closeness, the times when the other person suddenly becomes attentive again. Those moments feel real, and because they feel real, the mind begins constructing a quiet belief. The relationship is not broken, it just needs patience. This belief becomes the emotional glue holding everything together. Psychologists sometimes describe this as cognitive dissonance. When reality and belief conflict, the mind often adjusts the story instead of accepting the discomfort of the truth. So instead of seeing inconsistency as a warning sign, the mind reframes it. Distance becomes stress. Coldness becomes fear of vulnerability. Withdrawal becomes something you believe you can heal. Without realizing it, you slowly take responsibility for stabilizing something you never had control over. And that is where trauma bonds become powerful. Because the more effort you invest, the harder it becomes to step back. Every act of patience feels like proof of commitment. Every moment you stay feels like evidence that the relationship must mean something. But here is another quiet truth that rarely gets said out loud. Effort does not always strengthen a relationship. Sometimes it strengthens the illusion that the relationship can be fixed. And the mind, once invested in that illusion, begins protecting it. You explain their behavior to yourself. You defend them to other people. You remember the warmth and minimize the distance. Little by little, the emotional center of gravity shifts. Your focus moves away from your own well-being and toward maintaining the connection. But the moment awareness begins to return even slightly, something important changes. You start noticing the pattern instead of explaining it. You see the silence for what it is. You recognize the cycle instead of hoping it will disappear. This shift does not require a dramatic decision. It often begins with something much smaller, one moment of honest observation. You notice how your mood changes depending on their attention. You notice how relief appears the moment they reconnect. And suddenly, the mechanism becomes visible, not as a mystery, but as a pattern your mind learns to respond to. When that happens, the emotional grip begins to loosen, not instantly, but gradually, because awareness changes how the brain interprets the cycle. Instead of chasing the next moment of warmth, the mind begins asking a different question. Is this pattern actually good for me? That single question changes the direction of your attention, and attention is where psychological power lives. The less energy you spend maintaining the cycle, the weaker the cycle becomes. The fewer explanations you create for someone else's behavior, the clearer the pattern appears. Little by little, the emotional system that once revolved around the relationship begins to rebalance, and something surprising happens. The bonds that once felt impossible to break starts losing its gravity, not because the other person changed, but because your awareness did. And once awareness enters the system, the old pattern can no longer operate in the dark, which means that even the smallest shift in perspective, even something as small as 1%, can begin weakening a bond that once felt unbreakable.